This year, I volunteered once again to make a tech update video for FIRST at the national level. And we're going to see the full contents of that video here, but I wanted to add a little bit of commentary and some behind-the-scenes thoughts that weren't necessarily appropriate for a video on the FIRST Tech Challenge YouTube channel, but are more appropriate here on this channel. So let's take a look. Hello FIRST Tech Challenge, and welcome to Into the Deep, presented by RTX. So right off the bat, I put on a red shirt for this video. You understand how dangerous that is? This season, the documents that were previously called Game Manual Part 1 and Part 2 were combined into a single competition manual. It's not just a combination of Game Manual Part 1 and Part 2, it is a complete reformatting, and you'll know this if you've compared it to any of the previous manuals. And what you may not know if you aren't familiar with the FIRST Robotics Competition program and their manuals is it's formatted a lot like that. You'll see a lot of similarities across these two programs now. That was one of the goals of the design. With this change, a number of technology-related rules have been rewritten. Some of the rules provide additional clarity on existing restrictions, and others expand what is possible in FIRST Tech Challenge. Just a quick note about the clarity piece. I think how I've come to understand it is a lot of the rules have been rewritten in such a way that it's more clear why they are written the way they are, if that makes sense. So we'll see some examples of this as we keep going through the video, but I think the reason why the rule is there and the reason for its existence at all is much more clear in the wording of the rule itself. We'll see that again in a bit. Some of the key terms that we use have changed, such as the term operator console and arena, so be sure to check out the glossary at the end of the competition manual. FIRST Tech Challenge wants to give teams a lot of flexibility when it comes to constructing their robots. The trade-off is that teams have more responsibility to understand the parts they use and provide documentation to inspectors. So I'm saying this in a very matter-of-fact way. FIRST Tech Challenge wants this flexibility and has the responsibility put on teams, but that wasn't necessarily a statement that came from FIRST. That was my summary of the changes that are being made and, some of the rules that have been rewritten. So it's not necessarily the specific goal of FIRST or FIRST Tech Challenge to do things in this way. They didn't push back when I summarized the changes in this way, but just so you know, this was not their words. So it's just my summary. A perfect example of this is the new rule about legal servos. Instead of listing specific servos that are legal for use, the rule specifies the maximum mechanical output power and stall current that are allowed. Many of the servos used by teams today already meet these requirements, and will be included in the legal parts list. Other servos that aren't listed can still be legal, but it's the team's responsibility to check that they meet the requirements and provide documentation to your robot inspector showing that they do. This gives teams the maximum amount of freedom, while addressing the trend of increasingly powerful servos finding their way onto FIRST Tech Challenge robots. Now, I made it sound like there's this trend, and I think there is a trend of increasingly powerful servos becoming more and more accessible, more and more affordable to put onto robots. There wasn't necessarily a specific incident, I don't think, that led FIRST to rewrite the rule in this way, but it is true that these more powerful servos are there, and it can be dangerous to have very powerful servos with high stall current on a FIRST Tech Challenge robot that only has a battery of a certain size. So that's really how I understand the genesis of this rule rewrite. It's more seeing what's happening and sort of trying to get ahead of it more than any specific, manufacturer or something, or any specific servo model being a problem. So I like the way that the rule is written because it is really attacking that specific problem. This is kind of what I was talking about before. High stall current is the issue that we want to address, so that is the actual restriction of the rule. I think that's pretty nice. Another example is the rewritten rule about minimum software versions for your robot controller and driver station devices. In the past, field inspectors have enforced minimum software versions for all of these devices. Now, these minimum versions are only recommendations. strong recommendations, but not required. This is another area where teams have greater freedom to use different versions of software that work for them. However, teams also have the responsibility to upgrade their own software. Field staff will not be able to provide comprehensive support to teams with older software versions. The piece about it being a strong recommendation to keep your software up to date, that was my wording. I'm sure that the folks on the First Tech Challenge tech team agree. You should definitely update your software and keep it up to date as the season goes on. But it's, as a field inspector and as an FTA, I want to strongly recommend that you keep everything up to date. My specific recommendation for teams is that early in the week leading up to an event, you make sure that all of your software is up to date. This should make sure that you're on the latest version for the event, but also give you some time to test it out and make sure it's actually working for you before you get to that event. So sort of best of both worlds. You have the latest, but also know that it works for sure. There are some things that you will absolutely have to update for. For example, if you want to use the latest April tag library without installing it yourself, then you're going to need the latest version of the First Tech Challenge SDK, because that's how you get the latest library instead of using last year's. So there are still a few things that will basically require you to upgrade, but we're not going to test it during field inspection anymore, which should make the field inspection process a lot faster for teams and a lot easier for inspectors, because we won't get into the situation where we have to bring you over to a laptop with the Rev hardware client installed and upgrade the software for you right there, and all of the potential issues that can happen as a result of doing that task. So overall, I think this is a good change. I think some teams are probably going to get more and more out of date if they don't use April tags, for example, or if they don't happen to run into something that causes them a problem. As the years go on, they may just continue using the same version, and that can put them at a disadvantage, which is a bummer. So we're still going to give you the advice to upgrade if we notice that you're on an older version. You just don't have to. This season, teams have more choices than ever when it comes to legal components for powering and moving their robots. This includes new motors in Rule R501, new battery options, including new form factors in Rule R601, and new power switch and servo power options. I didn't want to call out any specific manufacturer in this, but if you read through and look at the changes in the competition manual, the name that will stand out is Studica Robotics. And this may be a manufacturer that's familiar to you because they have sold structural components for First Tech Challenge robots in the past, but they are in those special categories now of, batteries, battery switches, servo power modules, those sorts of things that have always been really restricted down to particular manufacturers and particular part numbers. They're on the list, which I think is pretty cool. I have a video about Studica if you'd like to learn a little bit more about them. They were kind enough to send out a bunch of parts for our local teams at our local kickoff event, so I'm really thankful to them. And I think it's just cool that we have more manufacturers focusing on First Tech Challenge these days, because it can only make things better for the teams involved. The related rules about how devices must be connected have received important clarifications, so be sure to read them carefully early in the season. So when I say that the related rules about how things must be connected, a big one is how things are powered. And I think you should pay special attention to this if you are using LEDs on your robot. Before you wire any sort of extra electronics to the robot this season, really read through this rule and understand how things must be powered. Because if you're using any sort of external USB battery or anything like that, you have to be really careful how you connect the things together. So just keep that in mind. Another new item available this season is the Limelight 3A, a new Vision coprocessor that can be programmed with native support from the First Tech Challenge SDK. The Limelight looks very cool and I can't wait to get my hands on it, but I think one of the interesting things about the Vision-related rules now, you used to have this two-bucket approach where something was either a Vision camera, which connected via USB and streamed camera data back, or it was a Vision sensor, was something that was introduced last season, this idea of vision camera versus vision sensor. Those aren't really the buckets anymore, only to a certain extent. Now it feels like, at least how I've been told and how I understand it, the two kind of buckets you can think of, it's either it's a USB webcam using the UVC protocol. This is like your Logitech webcam type device being used over USB, sort of the way it was meant to be, or the device is something that has native support in the First Tech Challenge SDK. And that kind of makes it a level playing field for all teams. If you have the device, you all have access to use it without any advanced software or anything like that. So those are kind of the two buckets now. And of course, there are exceptions and there are still sensors involved and all that, but at least that's how it was communicated to me. Finally, teams should be prepared for some important changes when it comes to match flow this season. Teams will be required to select and initialize an op mode at the beginning of the match, even if it's their teleop program. This is big, and it's going to be a little weird and take some time for everyone to get used to, but basically, to summarize, before the match begins, we, as field staff, especially the FTAs, want to see the play button on your driver station device. So that driver station device must be visible so that we can inspect it. That's also in the rules this season. And we want to see any play button. It doesn't matter if you are initializing your autonomous program or if you don't have an autonomous program, initializing your teleop program. Even though for the first 38 seconds of the match, you're not going to use it, we still want to see the play button because that tells us a lot about how your robot is behaving. You've reached certain milestones in the communication between the two devices, and we have a higher level of confidence that you're actually going to be able to play the match. So it's going to be weird. It's going to feel weird asking teams to initialize their teleop before the auto portion of the match starts, but I think it's overall going to be a great change. Teams now have the option of stopping their autonomous program early, without penalty, and without affecting their ability to later run a teleop program. This is something we borrowed from First Robotics Competition that they started doing just last season, and that is sort of an A stop or auto stop. Here, it's the button that we use to do everything. There they have a specific button for stopping an autonomous program because they have that centralized field control. But I think this too is also going to give a lot more flexibility to teams. It makes auto a little bit less special because you can stop the program anytime without penalty, or this year without foul. And that means that you don't have to be so careful, right? Like you can do strategic stops on your autonomous program, which is kind of a bummer. But it also means that you can do it without penalty and you can pick up right where you left off. So if anything's really going wrong with your autonomous, you see that the robot is about to do something that's going to incur a foul, or even if the robot is about to do something that's unsafe, you can stop it. And then when teleop comes around, you can just start right back up with your teleop program with no issues. So that's pretty cool. It's also very important that robots do not move during the period between auto and teleop, including movement that may be caused by initializing servos. This is probably going to trip up a lot of people this year because it's very common to have some sort of initialization of your servos during the init portion of your program, and that's going to cause a problem. It could cause you to earn a foul, and if you keep doing it, it can escalate to yellow cards, which is a big deal. So basically, any sort of action that you were taking during the initialization phase of your teleop, this is often when you're reaching into the hardware map to find all of the devices. You may be setting the direction on your motors, or what people have often done in the past is set an initial position to your servos. You shouldn't do that last part. You shouldn't touch the servos. You shouldn't touch the motors during that init portion, because if it causes the robot to twitch at all, even if you're setting the servo to the position that it should have already been at, it may cause a momentary twitch, and that movement can earn you a foul. So unfortunately, it's going to trip people up for a while until we get used to it, but it is also a good change because it ensures that referees are able to score during that 8-second period between auto and teleop without any movement on the field, without having to worry about any of the robots disturbing game pieces or anything like that. Even though they're not on the field, it still makes their lives a lot easier. This kind of movement can result in a major foul and yellow cards for repeated violations. Be sure to review these rules and understand how they affect your code before you arrive at an event. And while you're at it, take a look at the new rules about the operator console, including new size restrictions. The size restrictions on the operator console are not ridiculous in my opinion. It is a good idea to keep your operator console, which we would have previously referred to as the driver station or the driver station assembly. You should probably keep it small, because it's something you have to carry around and you don't necessarily know what type of table will be waiting for you at the field. So you have to basically build your operator console in such a way that it may be sitting on some sort of tray, some sort of crate. You don't know what size. And there's also recommendations in there about keeping it light because, again, you have to carry it around, so don't be putting too much metal on it. A lot has changed this season, so it's a good idea to start fresh with a full reading of the competition manual. We think you'll enjoy the additional clarity and freedom in the robot construction and technology-related rules. Don't forget to arrive at your events with any necessary documentation for the materials that you use. That's all for now. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the deep. So I used the word we during that final conclusion portion, and I want to make it clear that we does not mean me at all. I'm not on the First Tech Challenge tech team. What that means is a bunch of people who have put in a ton of work on the things that you see and use all the time when you're working in First Tech Challenge, like the First Tech Challenge SDK and the scoring software and all of the compatibility between different pieces of hardware that you touch. So they are always in the background. They don't get enough thanks. I really want to say thank you to the entire tech team, both people on staff with First and volunteers on the team that make all of what we do possible. That's all from me. Hope you enjoyed this tech update, and I'll see you at the field.